Hello and welcome once again to episode 42 of Code Completion. We're a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionist, Spencer.
Hey there.
So before we get into our main topic, it's time once again for IndieAppSpotlight. Today we are checking out Calendar Paste by Christian Tietz, an iOS app that makes it easier than ever to deal with recurring events. Unlike on the Mac, Calendar for iOS has no way to easily copy and paste the same events over and over again. Calendar Paste fixes this by allowing you to create a template event and use it anytime to fill up your calendar with work shifts, meetings, and on-call duties, or any other regularly occurring event that happens, irregularly. Calendar Paste costs just $1.99 on the iOS App Store, and I know you all use your calendar, so please be sure to support Christian by getting Calendar Paste. Are you an indie developer? We want to hear from you. Please reach out to us on Twitter at CodeCompletion via DM so we can spotlight your app into the future as well. Which is a great lead-in to our main topic, accessibility. Isn't it crazy that Apple put no way to copy-paste calendar events into the iOS app of Calendar?
Absolutely, especially considering it's there on the Mac.
Yeah, I use that on the Mac constantly to fill in when I work so I can keep track of it. And I just copy paste or option click and drag the previous event, and that there's no way to do this on the iPhone drives me bananas because I want to copy paste. There's the location in there, there's everything, all the metadata is basically there. I just want to say do this again today or at this time. But yeah, no way to do that. And that kind of leads into the spirit of accessibility, is making it possible to use software no matter what situation you're in, whether that's a personal limitation, like you can't physically do something, or if it's a situational reason, like you can't currently use your hands or something. So having the options there to be able to do stuff in different ways, that all kind of plays into accessibility.
Yeah, and the reason we were kind of talking about this today is I recently had kind of one of those experiences where temporarily I needed to use some accessibility features on my phone. I had some surgery on my eyes that left me legally blind. I couldn't drive or anything for about 2 weeks, and I had to crank the dynamic text size of my phone into into the accessibility range. I think it was the second largest text size you could possibly do to
So
see
extra large.
Yeah, it was insane. I sent screenshots to Dimitri and the other code completionists, and it was, the text is just super chunky, and I was still, holding it very close to my face, squinting, and I could barely make it out. And I ended up listening to, podcasts and audiobooks for almost a week because I really couldn't see anything. And it just got me thinking about, there are people that deal with this every day, and as iOS developers, we really should be thinking about them because it's not an insignificant amount of people. I remember, I'm fairly sure it's a tweet. I'll have to find it, but when I taught accessibility, I would always show this tweet that said, based on some analytics from a fairly large app, I can't remember exactly what it was, they noted that over 25% of the users of their app used a non-standard text size on their phone, whether that's smaller or larger. It may depend. Some people just, crank it down so they can see even more, but I would probably say there's maybe more that use a larger text size than not. But regardless, I was in that situation where most apps at this point did have the ability to scale up their font size, but some didn't, and then I couldn't use them because I literally could not see it. And it just kind of got me thinking about, how can we be better about this, and how can we, if you don't know much about accessibility, how can we get started so that even if you are learning app development or if you've been doing this for decades, how can we best serve everyone and legitimately not leave out an entire portion of users that probably want to use your app, but if it's not accessible, they can't. Not that they don't want to. They, for whatever the limitation is, they possibly could not be able to do it.
And I'd just like to put this out there as like a first point. A lot of people might think that there's no financial benefit towards serving like such a small potential market. I want to go out there and say that this is a myth. This is probably the best like segment of your user base that will most enthusiastically push your app and share it by word of mouth and tell others about it, because there are so few good apps that hit all the points from an accessibility point of view, that if you do put the effort into there and a community learns about your app, they're going to share it amongst themselves instantly. So you're going to get some of the best users you can get. So from like the purely economic point of view, it's almost always worth it to put the effort into it, especially considering how little effort is necessary. Now, that's not the reason that you should be doing this, but if that's what guides how much time you're going to spend on an app, or you're trying to convince your employer, it's oftentimes one of the best and easiest things that you can go ahead and do, assuming you're not like writing everything from scratch and making your life a nightmare. But if you are building stuff with regular Swift UI, UIKit, it's fairly standard and fairly easy to add accessibility. In fact, most of your app may already be accessible. You just need to go ahead and audit it and make sure that it is. Now, that out of the way, whenever we say accessibility, we tend to think of VoiceOver, and specifically accessibility for blind users. And that's not where accessibility ends. Now, of course, adding all the functionality that you need for VoiceOver tends to flesh out the system for everyone else, for all sorts of different features that can be part of your app. For instance, if you don't have the motor capability to use a touchscreen, for instance, you have something called switch controls, and that will navigate through your screen even though you can see it. So it's not necessarily... you're not just adding features for people who can't see your screen. You're adding features that the whole system can go ahead and take advantage of. Like one that whenever we were teaching, for instance, I would use the unit testing and the UI testing class as like a pivot and just say, okay, like UI testing, this is something you need to do because it's a check mark on a resume. But like, let's go into accessibility and learn about that instead. And oh, look, the UI testing is done for us. Like we didn't have to do anything. So like even from that point of view, and then automating screenshots, so that way you always have up-to-date screenshots on the App Store, like all of that just plays into it with this initial set of time investment. So there's quite a lot to accessibility. And Spencer, you brought up some particular ones like dynamic text, where you can change the font size. So what are the other ones that you found that you had to turn on or to tweak so that way you can go ahead and use your devices during these past week?
For the most part, it was just dynamic text. There were a couple times that I used the I don't know what they call it, the magnifier or
Zoom.
Just zoom, yeah. It just lets you zoom on a particular part of the screen. But for the most part, after the first few days, I could see well enough to just use dynamic text. That was very large. But other than that, we've got things like, it's not necessarily an accessibility feature, but things to think about, like contrast ratios, making sure that your text is visible. I'm sure you've probably seen this, where there's like this hideous yellow background with some white text on it, and you can barely make it out. And it's like, okay, well, if someone who has poor vision, how are they going to see it if someone with normal vision can't see it at all?
It doesn't help you to make it bigger.
No, yeah, exactly. So, we've got things that are catered towards people with specific accessibility needs, but also it's not just about that, but anyone can benefit from kind of this philosophy of having a well-designed app. And it really, like Dimitri said, makes you think about the app. Like if you're going through and adding accessibility identifiers and labels for your UI testing, that's a great sort of overlap there. But then it's also helping people that use VoiceOver, switch control, and all that. So it's maybe a little bit less of an time investment for those things, for Apple's built-in accessibility features, than you may think if you're already sort of using those things as well.
And something that Apple has kind of been doing during the past, I would say, decade. How long has it been since iOS 7? Where they are kind of pioneering their own road towards simplifying the user interface and getting rid of button shapes and things like that. And they found the need to reintroduce many of these options as accessibility options. So accessibility on the Mac and on iOS has sort of become, and I don't want to call it a junk drawer, but it's kind of like the preferences of the old days where you would just customize your experience. All those customizations are now live in accessibility under the guise that most people should be fine with this, but some people might not be. And that's where they're kind of throwing all these different options. So if you've never visited the accessibility section of your Mac or iOS device, I invite you to go ahead and do so, because there are a ton of options in there that can make your usage of the device better. And some come with a whole bunch of changes all at once. Like there's a button shapes one, but that will also put underlines all over the place and kind of make things a little hideous at the same time. Whereas Apple could have not needed this option, or maybe had make more obvious, have an option that's called make more obvious or something like that, where everything just had button shapes to begin with, like they used to. So if you design accessibility first, like for everyone, then you tend to not need as many options. In fact, I've joked around that maybe Apple should ship with all these options on and force you to go into a minimalist section for those people that like things that are nice and clean, and you can turn things off there, because for the most part, for everyone, it makes their life easier for a lot of these options to be on. And it's kind of silly that they start by default being off, and they are categorized as accessibility, because all that really does is, yes, I guess it does bring people to the accessibility section, but it also makes it harder for people that need like actual accessible features to find what they're looking for, because it's hidden behind all these things that they probably just don't care about for the most part. So it's definitely a balance that you need to, as an app developer, keep an eye on. But it's not hard, and I want to dispel that as early as possible. Like adding accessibility features, oftentimes, like in the case of dynamic text, as long as you don't custom like choose a font for every label that you have in your app supports dynamic text. You might need to do some things to change some layouts for the larger sizes, and that's a fun design challenge, honestly. Like it doesn't need to look hideous. In fact, the font doesn't need to take, like one letter doesn't need to be the size of the screen. That's not helpful to anyone. So you can set maximums to these sizes, and you decide what to do in your app in certain cases. In fact, myself, I like to put the accessibility text all the way down so I can get a lot more content on my screen.
Right.
And that's because although I need glasses to see and I'm legally blind without them, you'll find the term legally blind is very liberously used. But like if I take off my glasses, I can't see 2 feet in front of me. But with my glasses, I can see like pixel perfect, super clear. So like I make use of that. And different people make use of different things. So if you make the options available, or if you design from the start to kind of have that, and perhaps consider the minimalist section of your preferences where you can turn everything off and have something super clean and no shapes or anything. It's just color. If that's what you want. But yeah, I lost track of where I was going.
No, I think that's awesome. And I think a perfect example of this, and one place that I saw didn't really implement dynamic type very well, was in widgets specifically, where a lot of them would just kind of default, have default text scaling, which was not great in a lot of cases. However, Apple's weather widget, which I think I've got on like the largest size, it's the rectangle, did really it was great about it. Changed the layout based on the dynamic text size, where normally it will give you like a 7-day forecast, and I think it's been a few weeks now. I think it kind of shifted to about half of it was a large kind of current temperature, and then I think it gave you either the next 3 days or the next 3 something, and it was actually something that I could read at a larger text size. So those tweaks to make it work with any layout, both smaller and larger than the normal text size, I think are awesome. And that one just stuck out to me because it was one of the few widgets that did that. And like Dimitri said, we're kind of at a point where I think it was it iOS 13 or 12 where they started doing the text styles, and it kind of automatically would have dynamic type enabled. So a lot of times you don't have to do much, if anything. The times when I've messed with or had to change things based on dynamic type, and that the scaling of text, for example, was letting your cells, for example, have a higher height, and instead of having a fixed height, so the text could actually grow, or have multi-line labels or something like that. But it's really not that hard, and you get a fair amount of benefit from both normal users, but also for people that really do need that for whatever the reason is.
Yeah, oftentimes it's basically switching between an H stack and a V stack. So if you have things that are horizontally laid out, if you have text in there, or even if you don't have text, if you have icons in there, as you make things bigger, they need more horizontal space on your screen, and horizontal space is at a premium. But vertical space, there's plenty of it, and oftentimes you can scroll. In fact, I would suggest make every screen that you work with a scroll view. Even if you don't need a scroll, it's going to save you whenever you need to make your UI work on like smaller screen devices, or if people use there's actually when you set up a phone for the first time, you're actually asked, do you want to use the phone at this bigger size where everything is ginormous?
Right.
And that's actually the original iPhone layout. Or do you want to use the native pixel resolution at 2x or at 3x? So if you choose the big version, like no apps work with that because no one bothers to check it. In fact, if you've kind of hopped on the iPhone train since day one, like that's the same horizontal screen space that's available to you. So if you can lay things out well in that regard, where like you can change things from an H stack to a V stack and then have everything in a scroll view, so that way it will always be accessible if space runs out. That kind of covers you in most cases. So in terms of layout, that's like my go-to technique is anytime I know that there's going to be like multiple lines of text and it's not just one kind of layout that's being set up, instantly scroll view, because you're going to need to scroll things eventually.
Yeah. Not that everyone is always in this position, but I recently started not recently, it's been a while. During COVID, I started rewriting one of my apps because I wrote it years ago, and I just have learned a lot since then. So the kind of one of my goals was to make it as accessible as possible, and that was implementing accessibility labels and identifiers, both for the UI testing side, but also for the accessibility side of things, and also doing exactly what Dimitri said, where I've got a popover controller on it's an iPad app, so you've got a fair amount of screen real estate, but still text is small, and so I put it in a scroll view, and normally I was able to fit all of my settings on the screen at once at a normal text size, but again, as soon as you up the text size, it goes off the screen and you can't see everything. So putting it in a scroll view and allowing things to be laid out with as much vertical height as they wanted, it basically solved it. So very simple things can really fix or alleviate a lot of, I think, what we may initially perceive as this huge problem to implement accessibility. It really isn't that bad. I just want to point out also, I'm no expert on accessibility. I definitely need to continue learning about it, and I don't know everything, but the few things I have done with it are much less tedious than I think a lot of people make it out to be, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. And here's a free idea if you work at Apple or if you make Mac apps. Anytime there's a window with a scroll view on the Mac, if that window is partially off screen, I would go ahead and say, like, I don't think anyone does this, but I would go ahead and say you should go ahead and offset your scroll view a tiny bit so that way you can scroll that content on screen. Even if the window is like hanging off the edge, the ability to be able to scroll it back in view, that would be the perfect accessibility feature to add, because very often you run a space, so you kind of move one window over here, one window over there. Being able to just scroll rather than move the window back to like a main prime position, that would solve most people would not want to move their window anymore, because you don't need to if you can just kind of scroll it in place. So fairly easy to kind of implement and get all the details just right, and it will, like, the first time someone notices that your app does it, everything else will feel broken. So a free idea for any Mac developers out there to go ahead and add that. I think it will make a lot of people super happy. But going back to what you said about like getting better at dealing with accessibility, the only way to really do that is to use it. So if you go ahead and turn on VoiceOver on your phone, while you're getting to get to know it, like, you can go ahead and play around with it, but do look up Apple's like documentation on how VoiceOver works. There are a ton of gestures and special features that VoiceOver users are going to be super comfortable with. They all know those. They've been using them for a decade and a half. But you don't know any of them. So if you say, oh, my app is accessible, and you don't support the ability to change headings really quickly to go to a different part of the content, then your app is going to feel broken to someone's. It's like as easy as scrolling. You would just scroll, but they can't necessarily scroll super quickly. It's just page at a page, page by page. So if they can jump to the bottom or jump to a certain section, that's like more than useful. So that is something that you can get better at by learning more about. And one of the best features, once you do start to use it more often, is the screen current. So this will turn your screen black, and this will kind of force you to use it like someone who can't see, because you literally can't see your interface. You know your interface better than anyone because you have it memorized. Right. But that kind of levels the playing field a little bit better, and allows you to kind of get lost in your own UI and try to navigate around. As long as you can like have someone pick a random screen and turn the screen curtain on, and then you can navigate around and figure out where you are, I would say that is a passing test for you've done the bare minimum of adding labels. Now, as we said, it seems like a lot of work to go ahead and do all this. In terms of actually making your app accessible, it's finding all the buttons and stuff that just has images instead of text and giving them proper labels, telling the system what they are, identifying any custom controls that you wrote that are not buttons that behave like buttons. Tell the system, hey, this behaves like a button. Those are called accessibility traits. Now, it works a little bit differently on the Mac OS side versus the iOS side, but the basic APIs are both there on each of them. So definitely go ahead and audit your app. There are good tools in Xcode to go ahead and highlight with your mouse to kind of see like what every field has. And I believe there's tools to audit it and to tell you which controls don't have any proper accessibility labels. So that can really help you flesh out the details.
Yeah, like Dimitri said, you've got the I think it's called the accessibility inspector that's in Xcode. I think if you just hit the Xcode menu and then it's like tools. Well, let me do it real quick. Xcode.
Open Developer Tool Accessibility Inspector. It's in the doc too.
Yep. And then if you've got the simulator running, it's cool. You can kind of have this little crosshair and just hover over any item in the simulator, or if you're running your Mac app, and just see, does this have an accessibility identifier label? I think it'll give you colors. It's been a hot minute since I've used it, but a lot of good information there. You can also change the dynamic text size right from the accessibility identifier to make sure that things are scaling the way that they should be, and also things are actually scale if the app is running. You change the text and kind of go back. So a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, they're all live, so you can instantly see the results. Also shout out to SwiftUI's previews. You can go ahead and set different dynamic type settings and see them all at once. So you can go ahead and see what your UI looks like in all sorts of different situations. This is a super cool screenshot for you to take for your own like marketing website. You can say, hey, look, I'm super accessible in terms of how I support this, and the people who need it, they will notice. The people who don't need it, they will learn about something new that they didn't know existed, and then they will feel like everything else is ruined that doesn't support it. So,
right.
there's a lot of that going on here.
So going back to what you were saying with using your phone with like the screen curtain and everything, there are people that, when they're used to that, they're using VoiceOver at like 400% speed, and they're just very quickly going through the UI because that's how they navigate. As someone that could still see the screen but had to bump up the text size, it was frustrating for me. I can't even imagine when an app is inaccessible and they have to just scroll through a bunch of buttons that have no label, that just says, whatever button, and it's not clear the intent of whatever you're trying to use in the app for every UI element, and not being able to navigate in sort of sections like Dimitri talked about. That's something that would turn you off of using the app. So there's no reason that we should be doing that to other people, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm. And like we said from the beginning of this, like accessibility is not just the features for the people that aren't 90% of your user base. Like it is everything about your UI. Like something that I like to point out to people is if you look at dark mode on the Mac, it's not actually that dark. Right. In fact, it's quite bright, but it's just, since there's an absence of overwhelming white, you perceive it as dark. So anytime you're building out a UI that should be dark, don't necessarily use pure black, because that is not going to give you a lot of room to have borders and shadows on things. And if you can't have borders and shadows on things, you don't have a lot of control over contrasts between different elements and hierarchy. And that makes it harder to navigate your UI. It's not even a visual thing anymore. It's purely about conceptualizing how your UI is put together. And that falls apart as soon as you don't have all these visual cues to help it along. So there's all sorts of cognitive levels next to the visual ones and auditory ones that can help put your app together. For instance, there are a lot of apps that don't even know that your phone has a speaker. But then there are some that use it effectively. Any action that you do, they're going to make a little tiny sound that's focused on that action. Maybe they'll use haptic feedback, and although you can't hear it, it's still a sound, though it's at such a low frequency that it vibrates your phone. So using all those affordances help reinforce what is going on the device, and they can help all sorts of people, whether you're completely capable of seeing your screen, but you're kind of using your phone out of your out into your peripheral vision. You can know what's going on just by feeling it, and that's a powerful thing. So if you design like this from the beginning, it makes it really easy to incorporate these really cool features, honestly. And at first you might overdo it, like with everything, just like with the iOS 6 era of designs. Like UI designers, we overdid it when we were trying to have rich Corinthian leather on our status bar. But there's a lot that was effective there in terms of teaching people how to use this device that they weren't necessarily used to. And that's the whole reason why people are a whole lot more comfortable with iOS devices than full-blown computers. And it's due to that they were able to get accustomed to it very quickly because it's what they knew. So all of these aspects play into accessibility, and it's important to kind of consider them all.
Yeah, I sometimes wish that, I don't know how it would work, but I sometimes wish that we all, as iOS developers, had some mandatory lessons on user interface design and user experience design, and thinking about what is this contrast ratio? Does this make sense from a user perspective? How to navigate through the app or whatever it is, because I just will blaze through trying to make something and just kind of forget about a lot of that stuff if I'm not from the start, thinking, okay, how can I improve this accessibility? How can I make this either, well, yeah.
And maybe I'm going to be ranting here a bit, but the Human Interface Guidelines, Apple's HIG, this used to be a very technical document, and it's turned into a very general kind of loose guidance kind of document over the years. It used to specify the exact amount of points that two buttons would be next to each other, or a button and a checkbox, and all sorts of little technical details like this. And it went over in terms of contrast, like how thick do your line segments need to be for it to be high enough contrast with this foreground color and this background color. Like that used to be spelled out for us in the HIG, and it's not anymore.
Yeah.
Not that I've noticed, and I haven't read it recently. Ever since it got like more and more general purpose and not super technical, I've been reading it less and less. But I actually enjoyed that. So if anyone wants to write like highly focused technical documentation on what people should look out for in terms of checklists and while they're building their app, like I think that will be very much appreciated.
Yeah, going to the human interface guidelines, it's been a while since I've looked at them, but it does have some good information in there. Like I just brought up the visual design part of it, and it says, use color judiciously for communication, kind of use color for calling to attention, or making sure that your color looks good, probably more contrast-wise than anything in both light and dark mode. So there's good information in here that's not necessarily... it's just good design, both for anyone, really, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
It's a good primer.
Yes, exactly. And it'll talk about, let's see, if we go to...
It'll introduce you to a bunch of these topics, so that way you know that you can look further into them.
Right. Typography, saying, when do you want to use like monospace fonts, and it'll actually show you how things scale with dynamic text sizes. So like going from a size in points, kind of translating to the styles that we have from like extra small to extra large. And then, those are the sizes, and then the styles are like caption, title 1, whatever. Kind of giving you a more or less idea of how things could scale. Maybe that would help in mocking things up. If you were using like Sketch or Figma, you could grab those text sizes and play around with it before you throw it into Xcode if that's kind of your thing. So there's good information in there for sure, really for anything. And it's, like Dimitri said, it's not necessarily quite as specialized, but like Dimitri also said, it's a good primer.
And I've actually been using like accessibility features my entire time, like using a Mac. Some of my favorites are like the screen zoom. So if you don't know, you can configure the control key to be hooked up to your scroll wheel. So basically, anytime you want to zoom in on something, you just hit control and then scroll up, and your whole screen will zoom in at that point. There are a ton of different options here. You can have it zoom in a window. You can have it follow the mouse. You can have it only move when the mouse hits an edge. All sorts of different settings there that are useful to go ahead and configure. And I've been using that like always. I always have closed captioning on whenever I'm like watching something, and that's just purely because I can't comprehend people without like seeing them talk to me. And like I'm horrible on the phone, for instance. So having something where I can read what they're saying at the same time that they're saying it often helps me understand what's going on. Otherwise, I just can't hear them. And this is despite the fact that I can hear fine. It's like a purely cognitive thing. So having extra helpings there is super useful. Being able to customize the font. For instance, I'm dyslexic, and a lot of letters are just confusing to me, and I won't even notice I pressed the wrong one. So having a different font for different use cases, especially when I'm like coding, can help me be able to read my own code better. And although it might look horrendous for someone else, it's preferences for myself. So that's something that I will always go ahead and set. The ability to change size on a moment's notice, Command plus, Command minus. Those are also super useful features that I will use constantly. So it's although you may not think that you need accessibility features, it can be super useful to everyone, is I guess the point I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, no, that actually reminds me, regarding dyslexia, I've recently been playing a game on like a PC game called Loop Hero. Super fun, but anyway, it's very like it's pixelated. It looks like like an 8-bit, 16-bit game. and it's pretty basic as far as the settings go, but there is a dyslexic friendly font, and I'm not dyslexic, but the normal kind of pixelated font made my eye, like, it was hard to read after I was playing for a while. So I turned that on, and it actually helped me be able to kind of read the text easier. So just because it's, made for whoever specifically, it can help you too. Like Dimitri talked about, I use the control zoom when I was teaching live on a projector because it was easy to kind of focus in on one part. On the iPhone, for example, back tap is in the accessibility menu, and I used that for a while for accessing I think it was the control center. I don't think it was notification center. To turn on the flashlight easier without having to kind of weirdly hold my phone and swipe up from the top corner. So lots of good features that anyone can really benefit from.
This week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Super Easy Timer. Super Easy Timer is a quick and easy to use timer app for your Mac. It's completely text-based, so you can type in English what you want, 20 minutes or 5 p.m., hit enter, and instantly start a timer. The timer understands English text to create, update, and start a new timer. You can quickly change an active countdown, even while it's still counting down. There are simple keyboard shortcuts to reset or pause, but otherwise no menus, no sliders, just use English to control your timer. We want to thank Super Easy Timer for sponsoring our show. Search for Super Easy Timer on the Mac App Store today to give it a try. And now that we've gone through our topics, it's time for Complete the Code, where we quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. Spencer?
Yeah, so last week we had the Objective-C error handling question, and we asked what could go wrong with it. So we do have a winner this week, and that is Frank, who writes, the if statement should be testing result, not the error, which is completely correct. Since some methods may set an error prematurely, but still return success if they were able to recover from the error. Not to mention pre-arc, the variable you could pass in could have been initialized to garbage memory. So this week we have an open-ended accessibility-related question for you. So if you're listening to the podcast, please check the podcast art or the show notes as always to follow along. So given the Swift UI button below, how could you make it accessible?
So can you complete the code? Tweet your answers to us with hashtag CompleteTheCode, all one word. The goal of this one is to show you how easy it is to add accessibility. So there will be multiple winners depending on how many different solutions people submit. Go ahead and tweet at us, and we look forward to seeing your answers. So as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Code Completion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's ever a topic you'd like for us to dig into. Most importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. Once again, I want to give my thanks to Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SpencerCurtis on Twitter, for joining me this week. My name once again is Dimitri. You can find me at Dimitri Buniol, that's DimitriBouniol, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
It's weird what people will pay. I saw that someone bought like an NES cartridge of one of the Mario games for $1.5 million the other day.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna put it on a shelf and not
people are saying that's money laundering.
It's
there's something fishy going on there that they're using that as a front.
Yeah, that and like NFTs.
Seriously, oh my gosh, the amount of money people are spending to claim ownership rights on an image that is distributed everywhere. Makes no sense.
It's a weird thing. People are making such bank from it. Someone made like $69 million from one of his... It was like one image of like 1,000 images or something that he had made over, once a day or something, and he made like $69 million.
Well, it's good for him. Being an artist finally paid off. Take that, Mom.
For one person, yeah.
Well, that's usually how it works for art.
That's true. Good point.
It pays off for one person. That's about it. Oftentimes when you're dead. It's really unfortunate that we, as a result, put no concentration on the arts. Like it would be useful for app development if you know your basics on good composition,
Right.
But can't practice any of that. STEM all the way nowadays. Look how often we use math. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. And I was super bummed because that's kind of what I was going into for college, and I just realized like I suck at this. Like this is bad. I can't do any of this stuff. So, yeah, I wish I could because it really is, like I said, something that I wish we were all better at as developers. In general, I think there are great developers who are, but a lot of times the design sense just slips me by, and I'm like, I don't know, this is easy and it looks okay to me, but then someone comes around, they're like, yeah, this is garbage. I'm like, okay, sorry.
Well, oftentimes it's just practice, right? And training your eye to spot good designs. And once you ruin your own ability to like see things without a critical eye, then you can start practicing on your own stuff, because anything you make, you'll be like, this is garbage. I'm never showing this out to the world. And then you either stop there or you continue practicing.
Yeah, definitely.
Usually one of the two options.
Right. Yeah, definitely have to be like impartial to yourself, I guess. I guess that's why like designing in Figma or something is nice, because it's like quick iterations and you get less attached.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely takes a lot of effort to get good at design. It's not something that happens overnight. And I feel like every designer looks at their past work and be like, what was I thinking? How did I think that was a good idea?
Just like our code,
like,
I guess.
Yeah, it's like with practice you get better at it, and your eye for it gets better, and as a result you hold yourself to higher standards, and you have to deliver on the standards.
Right.
So, which I think is easier now with all the tools that we have available.